In this supplemental video for the skills system, we're going to walk through the main objects associated with the UI elements to get a connectivity between how we interact through the UI elements. So this video will cover the UI aspects. Then we'll do another video talking through the gameplay effects, and then another one on the gameplay abilities to sort of break up the sections so that you can go to whichever section is most helpful for you. So when thinking about the UI elements, just pull up we have a variety of, and I've just pre-opened all of the different classes. So the very beginning of the UI chain is defining your input action. And so we have an input action that defines a digital bull input action in the enhanced input action system that is responsible for toggling the player attribute window on screen. That is referenced in the input mapping context class. So we have our input mapping context class that says we want to associate this input action to the letter L. And we also want to make that player mappable so that it shows up in the UI as player attributes, and the player can reassign it to a different letter of their choosing. We also would have an input mapping context for the touchscreen. We'd have an input mapping context for a controller. This just happens to be the keyboard and mouse one, which associates the actual key with the input action. The next part of the chain is in the Lyra input configuration class, where you define the relationship between the input action and the corresponding input tag. So this allows you to say, if this input action is triggered, regardless of how, in our case, it's by pressing the letter L, then fire off the input tag window player. That window tag is then picked up by the ability set and associated with the toggle window player gameplay ability. So the gameplay abilities that are granted to the player in the skills ability set either have an input tag associated with them, like the toggle window does, or they're not associated with an input tag. And these ones are then given passively to the player, but they are not connected to an input tag, and therefore it's up to the code or the logic to call those gameplay abilities if and when they're needed for game execution. So all of those things lead us to pressing a letter and ending up calling the gameplay event toggle window player, which is a simple gameplay ability that will show the widget when the corresponding input tag is received. And in this case, the only thing that it does is you define which widget you want to spawn, which is W player, and that widget will be shown in the CommonUI framework, and we'll take input control from the game and hand it to that widget. So that's our first sort of widget. That widget is based on the common activatable widget. So this is the layering stack for the CommonUI layer inside of Lyra. You can see here that we have basically a border to allow us to apply some padding. We then include a horizontal box, which is broken into the navigational pane as a vertical box. So we have two buttons inside the navigational pane, one to show skills, one to show abilities, and then we have our vertical box, which has an animated switcher which will switch between our skills window and our abilities window. And then finally, we have a back button at the bottom. So by using the buttons, some horizontal and vertical boxes, and then this animated switcher, we're able to basically encapsulate the high-level logic of how we want our UI to function. So if we look at that graph, it's not doing an awful lot of things. So upon activation of the W player widget, we take our skills window and refresh the tree. We take our abilities window and refresh its view. So upon activation, both views are refreshed. And then we sit and wait. If the skills button is clicked, then we use the animated switcher. We set the active widget to this widget, which again has to be a sub element. So here you see that I have the animated switcher. And underneath that, you have the skills and the ability as children. So when you are on the graph, you can basically, these two are identical. If I click the skills button, the animated switcher makes the skills button active and we refresh the skill tree. If I click the abilities button, the animated switcher makes the ability window visible and we refresh the ability window. The only other thing that's happening here is the back button. In the case of the back button, we deactivate the window. And when we deactivate the window, we pop that content off the layer. So that's what shuts down the player stat window. All right, from there, the ability widget basically constructs a couple of slots for the abilities to be dropped into. It uses our standard inventory grid from, I want to say chapter 5, to show what items I have in inventory. And on the graph, we're basically performing an initialization where we grab our inventory, cache it as our inventory manager, and then listen for any refresh events that might be coming through the gameplay messaging subsystem. When we receive those events, we would refresh the slots, which basically means we grab the standard inventory grid, we refresh the grid, and then we refresh the slots on the screen. So the refresh view updates this grid here, and it updates these three assignable slots here, here, and here. For skills, the skill widgets are pretty basic and not very dynamic. We basically, for the demonstration, just have a text box, a vertical box, and then inside that, a series of horizontal boxes that have a little bit of padding. So tier 4, tier 3, tier 2, and tier 1 are simply just layered on the screen with some padding. And then inside the skill slots, we just insert instances of our skill slot, which have exposed different parameters. So what item definition do we have in this skill slot? So this is the 04 item definition, this is the 5 item definition, and this is the 6 item definition. The graph, not that dissimilar from the other ones, a little bit more content here, where on initialize, we do our normal caching of all of our elements, the inventory manager and the fragments. We find out how many skill points the player has. We refresh the tree and we listen for any changes. The refreshing of the tree says, go ahead and refresh each tile independently. So 1 through 6 get refreshed. Go grab how many skill points we have in inventory. This is a currency type inventory that we talked about in the other video. Put that on screen. And then the only two things that we can do is either add points, which is a temporary button on the bottom right, where we can trigger a gameplay event through the ability skill, add new skill point gameplay event, or we can reset the skill tree and send the reset. So these two messages that are being sent to the actor are then associated and picked up by their corresponding gameplay abilities to perform their actions. And at the end of those actions, they call a refresh to refresh the screen. And then inside of the skill slot, which is the visual representation of the skill, which is a button so that you can click it, an image inset, which is this black and white image in the middle, and then how many points it costs in the bottom right-hand quadrant. Most of the logic is here for the UI stuff. When we construct it, we want to make sure that the item definition, this is the ID underscore skill 1 or skill 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 is valid. If it is, we find that item in our inventory. So we find the default fragment for that inventory. We pull the icon off of that item in inventory and set the item on screen. Then upon initialization, we just have a routine where we're caching our object references. We're applying the refresh tile. We're setting our tooltip. So this is how you set a tooltip to show up on screen. Is you basically create your own tooltip widget, and then using the set tooltip node, you can establish what that tooltip needs to look like. And so that's how we're handling our tooltip on hover. And then the refresh says, all right, when I ask to refresh this individual tile, we have a function where we check the prerequisites and the skill points, and this basically determines whether it should be white or green or red. So we do this tile stat, which we'll look into in a minute. We update the point count on screen. If it is already activated, we take our activated constant color and set the color there. And we disable the button. Since it's already active, you're not going to click the button. If it's not active and we come back out of here with it is activatable, so we follow the true path, then we have our available constant, which these are just colors. So these are just, the green color, the gray color, the white color, and red if you can't afford it. So we take that constant, set the color to the button, and set the button to be enabled. Same thing if we can't afford it, we set the color to be red, and we disable the actual button. So when all of that is toggled together, you get, I should have went into that function. I press the L key. The L key calls the input configuration mapping, which calls the ability set, which maps it to the gameplay ability to toggle a window, which tells it to toggle the W player window. Upon activation of the W player window, both the skill tree and the ability windows trigger their corresponding refreshes, and we're up and looking like this. When I click this button, it gives us the accessibility to the next button, because the tree was refreshed. And the tooltip is this tooltip that's showing when I hover over individual buttons, was that tooltip logic that we showed a few seconds ago by defining a custom tooltip for each of those buttons. These are the buttons that trigger the reset. So they fire the message to the corresponding gameplay ability to reset. This one would fire the message to add a skill point, so I can add more skill points. And then as I click the skill or abilities button, the animated widget switcher is switching between the W skill window and the W ability window. So these are happening through the changing of the animated switcher. These are happening on click of the individual button. And so maybe we'll go back into that in just 1 second before we leave this section. So this function in the skill slot basically says, here's the mental logic. Get your item instance, which represents an individual skill. Grab the skill fragment off of that item instance. Determine how many points it needs. Then determine whether it's already been activated or not. So if this item has been activated, its skill activated will be on. We then do the check to see whether or not we're active. If we're active, we return the fact that we're active, and we, just for convenience sake, pass back this point cost. If we're not active, we're going to test, do we have enough points? If we have enough points, we're going to continue to test our prerequisites. And we're going to say, all right, let's go check each of the prerequisites and determine if they are activated. So if all the prerequisites are activated, and I've gone through this loop for each prerequisite, I'll come back and exit here and return back that it is activatable. And then for convenience, I'll pass back the points. If at any point it's not valid, in other words, one of the prerequisites failed, then we'll return out that not only is it not active, but it's not activatable. And so those all pass back to the event graph, these two bulls and the point cost, which controls the color coding of the various tiles. And then when we click on an individual tile, so when we click on an individual tile, assuming it's enabled, we will trigger this enable skill button, which gets the player state, gets the item instance that we clicked on, and passes that through this gameplay event. So we have the add skill event, which if you expand the skills and the add skill event, and you come over here, you can say search, and you'll get that tag is both issued by the skill slot and received by the gameplay ability. So when we send the gameplay event to the actor, that's this occurring. This event, and if I click it and go edit, this event is listening over here for that particular tag as a gameplay event. So that's the connection point between the clicking of the button and the adding of the skill. the adding of the skill receives an activation ability from event, because that's how we've set this up. It receives the event data payload, which was passed here, which included the item instance as an optional object. So we basically do a quick check. We get the inventory manager, make sure that's valid. We get the skill points, we make sure that's valid. We break that event data and take the optional object that came through the event data, and we cast that to our inventory instance because we know that that is what we passed in. So that should pass. We then continue our processing by finding our skills fragment, take the point cost of the skills fragment, make sure that we have enough, remove the point cost from our inventory currency because we're spending it right now. We're adding a new skill. We activate it in the inventory system by turning it on. Then we take the gameplay effect from the skill fragment and we apply that to the owner. This is what applies the gameplay effect underscore skill 1 to the player. And then if there are any items to be granted, we'll loop through that array of items to be granted, and we'll add those items to the player. So in the case of a skill where we have things to grant, we'll do them here in the loop. In the case of a skill where it is all about the gameplay effect, that'll happen here. And those are managed through the item definitions for skills. So for example, skill 4 has a fragment, has a skill fragment that says, these are the prerequisites. We check that in the condition. This is the gameplay effect to apply. So this gameplay effect is what gets applied right here. And then the grants array, which only has one entry in it, will give the player the ability for the meteor, which is this one. And so it gives this ability to the player. So one more time by I press L. I think it was this one. Need more points. When I activate skill 4, I'm given this ability. That's all I did. Now when I drag and drop that into the slot, I'm equipping that ability, just like we did in Chapter 6. So this part is identical to Chapter 6, where we're dragging abilities from our inventory into our active slots and executing from there. So hopefully that helps in all the UI aspects. Leave a comment or a like, and if there needs to be more, we'll explain more. Thanks. Take care.